The chandeliers shimmered like frozen stars caught midburst, casting fractured light across crystal glasses, polished cutlery, and the strict folds of dress whites and navy blues. In the grand ballroom of the Marlowe Hotel, the annual Navy Tribute Gala unfolded with precision, every smile rehearsed, every toast perfectly timed. Silver service clinked alongside whispered conversation, and beneath the glow of high society and higher ranks, Lila Porter weaved between tables, invisible by design. Her white shirt was pressed with care, her black apron tied in a perfect bow, but the fray at her sleeves and the quiet desperation in her eyes betrayed just how close her life was to unraveling. She was not a guest. She did not belong. But she needed this job more than she needed to breathe. To most in the room, Lila was just another server, a detail of the decor, meant to blend in, not be noticed. But each step she took was a silent battle, for her sick younger sister, for overdue rent, for the dignity she fought to keep while carrying trays heavier than they looked and burdens heavier still. Beneath that uniform, hidden under a starched collar, lay a pendant, an old, iron-forged anchor wrapped in a silver ribbon. It was all she had left of her mother, Dana Porter, a Navy cryptographer who'd vanished during a classified mission when Lila was just 10. There were whispers that Dana had died in service. Others claimed she'd been abandoned. But no one gave answers, only silence, folded flags, and unanswered questions. Lila never stopped wondering, never stopped waiting, never let go of the chain around her neck. That night, the gala buzzed with patriotic fanfare and polite distance. Admiral Robert Hayes, a man carved from discipline and myth, sat just a few feet away, unaware that the quiet server in his periphery carried a piece of his past that refused to stay buried. Lila hadn't slept. Sophie's medication had run out again. Her bank balance read 2 digits. But here she was, balancing a tray of filet mignon and brittle nerves, her posture crisp even as her thoughts spun. She moved swiftly, lips pressed into a line, trying to remain invisible. And yet the more she tried to disappear, the more the room, or fate, seemed determined to notice her. Then it happened, a simple misstep, a single slip, and everything began to crack. Before we continue, like this video and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more exciting stories that you won't want to miss. The tray wobbled in her hands as the fork clattered to the floor, bouncing once, then skidding beneath a nearby table. A few heads turned, their conversations pausing mid-sentence, but most simply stared, not at the fork, but at her. Lila's breath caught in her throat, a familiar heat rushing to her cheeks as her heart tapped a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She dipped down quickly to retrieve it, muttering an apology that no one really cared to hear. The linen napkin she used to wipe it trembled slightly in her grip. She straightened just in time to meet Evelyn's eyes from across the ballroom, narrowed, sharp, unforgiving. The older woman didn't speak yet, but her chin lifted half an inch in that subtle, practiced way that meant, "I saw that." Lila nodded once and turned her back, retreating to the service corridor before she could be summoned. Behind the safety of swinging double doors, she exhaled, chest sinking as the wall pressed cool against her spine. One mistake, just one, and everything could unravel. She reached for her pendant, a reflex by now, her fingers finding the metal through the fabric of her blouse. The anchor and ribbon design was worn smooth from years of touch, its edges softened by time and grief. Lila had been 10 when her mother, Dana Porter, disappeared during a Navy operation so secret no one would tell her what it was. The pendant had been mailed home in a small velvet pouch, no note, no explanation, just that one piece of her mother that somehow found its way back. Since then, it had hung close to her heart, even on the worst nights, especially on the worst nights. Lila remembered Dana's voice like a fading photograph, clear at first, then blurred around the edges. Her mother used to speak in riddles, layering codes even into bedtime stories, training Lila's mind without her ever realizing it. "If you ever feel lost," she'd say, brushing Lila's hair back with gentle fingers, "just follow the anchor, it always knows where home is." After Dana's disappearance, home had become a foreign concept. Their apartment turned silent, the colors dimmer, the air heavier. Sophie had only been a toddler then, barely able to understand where Mom had gone. Lila remembered rocking her sister through endless nights of fevers and questions she couldn't answer. When their father left, not long after the military funeral with no body, there hadn't been time to grieve properly. Only time to survive. At 15, Lila started waitressing part-time and forging their father's signature on school forms just to keep Sophie enrolled. She had tried to finish high school on time, juggling 2 jobs and a half-awake mind. Nights were for scrubbing dishes or folding linens, mornings for tests she didn't remember taking. But Sophie's asthma got worse, and hospital bills began to bleed through their savings like a burst pipe. So, Lila let the world call her dropout and instead learned to balance trays, negotiate late rent, and count change with military precision. The pendant became a weight she wore proudly, not out of sentiment, but because it reminded her that someone once fought to protect her. Now, at 25, Lila had grown used to being background noise in other people's stories. She moved like she belonged in the shadows, eyes forward, smile small, voice soft. She understood how to be invisible in rooms full of power, how to serve wine without hearing the toasts, how to carry meals worth more than her monthly salary without shaking. The Marlowe Hotel was her steadiest income in years, thanks to Evelyn's perfectionism and the hotel's high-profile clientele. But with every shift, it felt like she was walking a tightrope. One mistake, one smudge, one spill, and she'd fall. Tonight was especially difficult. The tables were filled with uniforms, medals gleaming, collars stiff, stories whispered behind crystal glasses. It was a world she didn't belong to, yet had been born from, raised in the shadows of. Her stomach twisted every time she passed a man in white, wondering if he had known Dana, if he lied at her funeral or stood by silent when the Navy washed its hands of her mother's name. These thoughts didn't help, but they came anyway, uninvited and sharp-edged. Voices buzzed in her earpiece. "Table 7 still needs drinks," said another server, tone clipped. "Evelyn's making rounds. Watch your corners." Lila adjusted the tray in her hands, nudging the door open with her hip and re-entering the ballroom. Her smile was automatic now, soft, not too wide, not too strained. Her eyes scanned the tables like a radar, but her thoughts drifted elsewhere. She remembered the last birthday Sophie had before their world fell apart. Dana had come home late from the base, boots still dusty, her smile tired but present. She'd wrapped the pendant around Lila's neck that night, saying, "Someday, you'll understand why this matters more than medals ever could." Lila hadn't understood then. She'd wanted toys, a mother who didn't vanish into silence. But now, years later, she wore it like armor, like proof that someone had once seen her as something worth protecting. A man at table 9 waved her over, a signal for more wine, and she shifted direction, narrowly avoiding a passing guest. The tray balanced carefully on her hand wobbled slightly, but she steadied it. The music swelled briefly as a new string arrangement began, clashing with the hum of voices and the occasional scrape of silverware. Lila's shoes pinched. She'd outgrown them months ago, but couldn't afford new ones. Still, she moved with practiced grace. At the bar, another server whispered about Evelyn's mood. "She's on edge tonight. Watch your step." She already snapped at Greg for breathing too loud. Lila offered a quiet nod, her eyes flicking toward the far end of the ballroom where Evelyn stood like a hawk in pearls. Her posture was as crisp as her cream dress, her eyes sweeping the room with the efficiency of a general. Lila knew that look. Evelyn was waiting for someone to slip. The next hour passed in a blur of orders, table numbers, and mental math. Lila's hands ached, her spine throbbed, and still the tray didn't shake. She worked like a ghost, fast, silent, efficient. No one noticed her, and that was how she preferred it. Until table 11. She leaned forward to serve a plate, her elbow brushing the edge of a polished charger. It clinked just loud enough to draw Evelyn's attention. Lila's eyes darted to the corner, and sure enough, Evelyn had turned. Their eyes met for a split second before Evelyn narrowed hers and started walking. The moment stretched. Her chest tightened. She needed to move. She needed to finish this round and disappear back into the corridor where no one cared if her hair had come loose or her apron had slipped. But then it happened. Her heel clipped the leg of a chair. The tray tilted. A fork slid off the edge, a single, glinting arc of metal, and clanged onto the floor. The room didn't fall silent, not yet, but it paused. Evelyn's steps quickened. Her expression shifted from cold to predatory. And just as Lila bent to retrieve the fork, she felt it, the hush before the storm. Then came the voice. The fork hit the floor like a gavel, sharp and echoing against the ballroom's polished stone. Lila froze mid-motion, hand outstretched as the sound seemed to halt the air around her. Conversations dimmed into curious murmurs, necks craned, and laughter ceased as the rhythm of the night slipped offbeat. She bent quickly to retrieve the fork, but it was too late. Evelyn had already arrived, her heels striking the floor like gunshots. Lila looked up just in time to see her manager's mouth tighten. "Unbelievable," Evelyn hissed, just loud enough for nearby guests to hear. Her manicured finger pointed downward like a weapon, gesturing toward the dropped utensil as though it were a mortal offense. "I've told you before, Lila, we do not make scenes in front of our patrons." Lila stood slowly, trying to balance grace with panic, but Evelyn's voice rose another octave. "This is the Navy Tribute Gala, not some diner off the interstate. If you can't handle your job, then you're done. You're out. Right now." The words hung in the air, a verdict passed. A ripple of shock moved through the tables, followed by silence. Deep, suffocating, watching silence. Lila's lips parted, but no sound emerged. Only heat climbed to her cheeks as her vision blurred slightly at the edges. She wanted to disappear. Instead, she stood, tray still in hand, caught in the spotlight of 100 judgmental eyes. Evelyn didn't stop there. She turned to the nearest guest, a woman in navy chiffon, and offered a rehearsed smile. "Please excuse the interruption. Some people simply aren't cut out for this level of service." Lila flinched at the words, each one a public lash, each syllable reducing her further. Someone chuckled softly at another table. The sound sliced through Lila sharper than any insult. She swallowed hard, her tongue dry as sand. Apologies crowded her throat, but never escaped. What could she even say? That she hadn't slept? That she couldn't afford to be fired? That this job was the only thing standing between her and an eviction notice taped to her door? Her eyes burned, but she blinked fast, refusing to let the tears fall, not here, not in front of them. Evelyn's smirk widened, sensing Lila's breaking point like a lion watching a wounded deer. "Go," she said again, softer now, crueler. "Before you embarrass yourself any further." Lila gave a tiny nod, turned away, and walked toward the service doors like a sleepwalker in a nightmare. She didn't feel the tray in her hands anymore. She didn't hear the whispers, the forks clinking, the subtle hum of resuming conversation. All she could hear was the blood rushing in her ears and the words echoing, "You're done. Get out." She passed a table on her left, military officers, neatly aligned medals, pressed whites, when her shoulder sagged and her apron shifted. That's when the pendant slipped free. The silver glint caught the chandelier light just right, a flash, barely there, but powerful enough to shatter someone else's world in that moment. It swung against the fabric of her blouse, the old anchor and ribbon turning once like a compass needle, exposed for the first time tonight. At that exact second, Admiral Robert Hayes turned from his table, his conversation pausing mid-sentence. His eyes found the pendant. And everything stopped. His breath caught as if punched from his lungs. The chair beneath him seemed to vanish, the room growing suddenly silent in his mind though it still bustled with motion. That pendant. That exact pendant. He had held it once in his hands, long ago, before it disappeared along with the woman who wore it. Dana Porter. The name rolled through his mind like a ghost finally speaking after years of silence. He stood abruptly, his silver buttons gleaming under the chandeliers, his napkin falling forgotten to the floor. His fellow officers looked up, startled. Hayes stepped forward, eyes locked on Lila's back, on the pendant now swinging gently with each of her steps. "Excuse me," he said aloud, but no one knew who he meant. Lila reached the edge of the ballroom and pressed against the swinging doors to disappear. She didn't notice the hush behind her. She didn't notice Evelyn freezing in place, eyebrows lifted in confusion. She didn't see Admiral Hayes take 2 deliberate steps forward, like a man walking toward a battlefield long since buried. All she could think was, I can't cry yet. Not until I'm out of sight. But Admiral Hayes was already crossing the marble floor with purpose. He wasn't thinking like an officer or a guest or a man of reputation. He was thinking like someone who had failed someone once and now had one final chance to make it right. The pendant was more than jewelry. It was a legacy, a lifeline, a message carved into metal that said, "Don't forget me." And he hadn't. If you were Lila, humiliated in public and cast aside over a single mistake, how would you respond when someone suddenly recognized the truth behind something you thought only you carried? Could one object from your past change the entire course of your future? Comment below. Has a moment of public failure ever led to something unexpectedly life-changing for you? If you believe in stories where legacies refuse to stay buried, hit subscribe and join us. The sound of the pendant swinging softly against the fabric of her blouse echoed in Admiral Hayes's mind louder than any symphony. Time didn't slow, it split. One half of him was still standing in that ballroom, a decorated man among diplomats, silver hair and medals shining under chandelier light. The other half had been ripped backward through years, through gunfire, storm-soaked coordinates, and the last glance he ever got of Lila Porter. Her voice, her laugh, the way she held a pen like a conductor's baton while breaking codes, they all came back at once. He had given her that pendant the night before she shipped out for Operation Cold Horizon. A personal gift, nothing formal, just something small he hoped would mean something, should she ever feel alone out there. She had traced the anchor with her thumb, smiled softly, and said, "I always find my way home, Admiral. You should know that by now." Then she disappeared into the dark corridors of classified orders and military silence. And she never came back. He hadn't spoken her name aloud in over a decade, hadn't allowed himself to wonder if she was still alive or buried in some unmarked grave on foreign soil. He had convinced himself she was gone, killed in action, forgotten by all except him. Seeing that pendant now, worn by a woman who bore the same quiet strength, cracked something wide open. He had not just seen a trinket, he had seen a ghost, a message, a second chance walking away before he could stop her. Hayes pushed through the crowd without hesitation. "Miss," he said, his voice low but urgent, not loud enough to command, but strong enough to cut through her haze. Lila turned, startled. She hadn't realized anyone was following her. Her eyes widened as she recognized the uniform, the stars on his shoulder, the seriousness in his tone. She held the tray tighter against her chest like a shield. "Why, yes, sir," she asked, unsure if she was in more trouble. Hayes's eyes dropped to the pendant again, now resting silently against her blouse. "Where did you get that?" he asked. The question was simple, but it rang with the weight of years behind it. Lila blinked, confused, shifting the tray from one hand to the other. She felt suddenly exposed, uncertain why this man with such presence was speaking to her at all. "It was my mother's," she said, her voice cautious, but not defensive. "She wore it every day. I've had it since I was 10. Admiral Hayes swallowed hard, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. His throat worked once, but he said nothing. Instead, he leaned slightly forward, voice quieter now. "What was her name?" Lila hesitated, her instincts suddenly alert. Something in his expression wasn't judgment, it was recognition. She glanced toward the ballroom doors, half wondering if this was another humiliation coming from a different angle. But the sincerity in his eyes, grief-stricken, searching, held her still. "Dana," she said finally. "Lila Porter." The world tilted. Hayes had trained to survive enemy fire, icy diplomacy, even funerals without coffins. But nothing had prepared him for that name to return, not from an intelligence file, not from whispered regret, but from the lips of a girl standing right in front of him. His knees didn't buckle, but they wanted to. A tight breath escaped him as his hand unconsciously reached for the back of a nearby chair. He barely managed to whisper, "She's your mother?" Lila's brows furrowed, uncertain. "Yes," she said, voice tentative, her grip tightening on the tray. "Do you know her?" The Admiral didn't answer right away. He looked away, just for a moment, his eyes finding something distant, something not in this ballroom. What came wasn't just memory, it was weight, full and staggering. 15 years ago, Operation Cold Horizon had been one of the Navy's most sensitive missions, black ops layered in diplomatic deniability, where officers went in knowing they might not come back. Dana Porter had volunteered despite knowing the risks. She was the best in her class, fluent in 6 languages, with a mind that bent code like wire. And she was more than that, she was someone Hayes had allowed himself to care about, even if protocol never let him say it aloud. He remembered the night before deployment clearly. She had stood in the briefing room with coffee in one hand and the pendant in the other. "Just in case I need help finding my way home," she had joked as he fastened the clasp around her neck. He had almost said something, almost told her not to go, that he'd pull strings, find another assignment. But he hadn't. And she never came back. Hayes blinked away the flood of memory and turned his full attention back to Lila. "Dana Porter is one of the finest officers I ever served with," he said, his voice brittle now. "She didn't just wear that pendant. I gave it to her. The night before she left." Lila's lips parted slightly, her mind catching up to his words. "You knew her?" she asked again, this time not as a defense, but as a daughter hoping for a glimpse of the mother who'd vanished too soon. Hayes nodded. "I more than knew her." There was a pause. "Then, she saved my life. And I failed to return the favor." The tray in Lila's hands began to lower slowly, her arms no longer holding the tension. She didn't know this man, not really, but there was something in his voice that made her listen. Something she hadn't heard from any of the officers or bureaucrats who'd come and gone after her mother's disappearance. Not pity, not procedure, but sorrow. Real, aching sorrow. They stood there, 2 people from different worlds, bound by a single name and a chain of silver. Behind them, the gala moved on unaware. Evelyn watched from a distance, confused but clearly uneasy, unsure whether to interrupt. Uniforms passed by like ghosts. But Lila and Hayes were still, like something sacred had just cracked open between them. Not answers yet, but something undeniable. "Please," Hayes said softly. "Don't go. Not yet." Lila nodded once. She didn't understand what this meant. But in her gut, she knew one thing. This wasn't the end of her story, it was the page she was never supposed to find. Evelyn stood just beyond the polished archway, arms folded tightly, watching with narrowed eyes as Admiral Hayes spoke to the girl she had just publicly dismissed. She hadn't moved since the confrontation began, but now she took a step forward, her heels clicking with tension. "Is there a problem, Admiral?" she asked, voice tight, but laced with professional polish. The room, sensing something unusual, quieted again. Heads turned. Forks hovered over plates. Hayes straightened, his expression unreadable but solid. He didn't look at Evelyn at first, he looked at Lila, who stood pale and blinking beside him, pendant still gleaming against her chest. "Yes, there is," he said, finally turning to the woman in cream. "The way you spoke to this young woman, your employee, was unacceptable." A pause. Then he added, louder, clearer, "And it will not happen again." The silence broke like glass, gasps, murmurs, the flick of camera phones being raised discreetly under tablecloths. Evelyn blinked, caught completely off guard. "With all due respect, Admiral, this is a private staffing matter," she began, but Hayes cut her off with a calm, unwavering tone. "With all due respect, Miss Clark, this is no longer your matter to manage." He turned to Lila. "Come with me, Miss Porter. You've answered enough to people who don't deserve your explanations." Lila didn't move for a second. Her legs felt numb, her fingers still curled slightly around the now empty tray. She looked from Hayes to Evelyn, whose cheeks were beginning to flush a shade darker. But then, as if something inside her decided to try trust for once, she nodded. She set the tray gently down on the bar, tucked a stray hair behind her ear, and walked beside the Admiral. They made their way to a quieter corner of the ballroom, still within view, still inside the ornate, watchful space, but tucked away near a window draped in velvet. Hayes gestured for her to sit in one of the chairs meant for guests. She hesitated. Sitting at a gala she wasn't invited to felt like treason. But his eyes weren't condescending. They were kind. So she sat. Hayes took the seat across from her, removing his gloves slowly, deliberately. "I don't expect you to trust me yet," he said, his voice lower now, but still lined with command. "But I need to understand. Your mother, Dana, meant a great deal to me. And now, you're here, carrying that same fire in your eyes, and I have questions. If you'll let me ask." Lila stared at her hands for a moment, then slowly nodded. "I don't have much to give," she said, tone steady but quiet. "But I'll answer what I can." Hayes leaned forward, hands clasped between his knees, listening without interrupting. It had been a long time since anyone had looked at her like her voice mattered. So she started to speak. "My mom went missing when I was 10, she began. "We were told she died on a mission, no details. No body. Just a folded flag and the pendant you gave her. After that, it was just me and Sophie." Hayes nodded slowly. "Sophie's your sister?" Lila's face softened. "She's 10 now. Bright. Funny. Has asthma that scares the hell out of me. I've been taking care of her ever since our father left. He didn't last long after Mom's funeral. He couldn't handle it, I guess." Hayes exhaled, the guilt climbing higher into his chest like rising tidewater. "And you?" he asked. "Who took care of you?" Lila almost smiled, but it never reached her eyes. "No one," she said. "But I managed. Barely." He looked at her differently now, not with sympathy, but with the gravity of a man realizing the cost of something he failed to prevent. "You've been on your own a long time." She nodded once, firm. "Every job I could find, dishes, cleaning, night shifts. Anything that paid just enough for the rent and Sophie's meds. This hotel gig, it was one of the better ones. Until tonight." Hayes glanced toward Evelyn, who was pacing now, clearly flustered but not bold enough to re-engage. "She humiliated you publicly. That should never have happened," he said. "But tonight, something bigger brought us together. I don't believe in coincidence, Miss Porter." Lila met his eyes for the first time without flinching. "Neither did my mom." They sat for a long beat in that soft pocket of quiet, surrounded by chandeliers and uniforms and the sound of the world turning without them. Lila felt the weight of her pendant against her chest like a heartbeat. Hayes broke the silence with a breath so deep it sounded like a decision being made. "I'm going to help you," he said. "You deserve to know the truth." Lila blinked, unsure if she'd heard him right. "Help me? How?" "I want to find out what really happened to your mother. And I have access to the people and records that can get us closer than anyone else ever has." He paused. "But more than that, I want to make sure you and your sister are okay. I owe Dana that much, and I owe it to you." Lila sat still, absorbing it. No one had ever offered her more than a paycheck or a warning. Now, here was a man in a uniform with stars on his collar, telling her she mattered. That Sophie mattered. That her mother's memory didn't have to remain buried beneath redacted files and unanswered questions. She touched the pendant gently, feeling its cool metal settle against her palm. "If you really knew her," she said, voice steady, "then you know she never would have given up. On anyone. Not on you. Not on us." Hayes's expression folded slightly, like a wound trying to heal. "I know," he whispered. "And I won't give up now. Have you ever had someone unexpectedly step in for you, not out of obligation, but because they saw your worth when others refused to? Comment below, who is the person who helped you believe your story wasn't over? And if you believe some uniforms carry truth, not just rank, make sure to subscribe. The following morning, Admiral Hayes sat behind his desk at Naval Headquarters, the early sunlight casting a dull gleam across the surface of a sealed folder stamped "Confidential, Cold Horizon." The document had been hand-delivered from the Deep Archive Division after Hayes made a personal request, one of the few privileges still afforded to his rank. Even then, nearly every page inside had been marked with thick redactions, sentences blacked out like bruises over truth. He flipped through the pages slowly, jaw tight, eyes sharp. Operation Cold Horizon had been dangerous, yes, but this level of secrecy felt excessive, even for Black Ops intelligence work. Most of what he remembered from those days matched the sparse information allowed through the filters: infiltration in the South Atlantic, a joint task force between signals intelligence and Navy cryptography, unknown targets. Dana Porter's name was listed under Strategic Encryption Specialist, her file just as empty as the rest. No cause of death. No mission debrief. No closure. Hayes tapped the folder with his finger, heart heavy. He needed more. And there was only one person who might still know what had really happened. 2 hours later, Hayes walked down a quiet hallway inside a retired intelligence annex tucked behind a veterans hospital. The walls smelled like dust and cold coffee, and the flickering lights overhead hadn't been replaced in years. In the far corner office, past 3 locked doors and a rusting vending machine, sat Lieutenant Oliver Graves, now retired, now forgotten, but once one of the Navy's sharpest code analysts. He looked up slowly when Hayes entered, recognition flashing behind his thick glasses. "Well, damn," Graves said, leaning back in his chair. "Robert Hayes. I thought you'd never come asking." They didn't bother with small talk. Hayes dropped the Cold Horizon file on the desk with a soft thud. "I need the unedited version," he said. "Everything you couldn't say back then." Graves' smile faded. He reached for the folder but didn't open it. "So," he said, voice low, "this is about Dana." Hayes nodded. "Her daughter found me." That made Graves sit straighter. "She's alive?" he asked, eyes wide. "The girl I mean?" Hayes nodded again. "Her name is Lila. And she deserves to know the truth." Graves exhaled through his nose and rubbed his temples. "Back then, there were rumors even we couldn't confirm. Orders came down strange. Teams went missing. Files were sealed before bodies were identified. Dana's disappearance? Never added up." Hayes leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Do you think she was betrayed?" Graves didn't answer at first. He opened his bottom drawer and pulled out a worn leather notebook, flipping to a page marked with a red paperclip. "I think someone wanted her gone," he said. "And not because she failed. Because she found something she wasn't supposed to." That afternoon, Hayes arranged for Lila to gain temporary access to the Naval Archives, an unprecedented favor that cost him 2 calls and a personal signature. She stepped into the archive building with a file folder clutched to her chest, her fingers curled around its edges like armor. The rows of file cabinets and decommissioned tech buzzed with the quiet electricity of secrets. She moved slowly, overwhelmed at first, until she found a terminal that still ran on the old encryption system. The officer on duty looked at her with mild interest, but didn't ask questions. Lila typed her mother's name into the directory. The search yielded 8 entries, all restricted. Her badge gave her partial access, enough to view metadata, timelines, and a few scattered reports. She clicked on each with care, cross-referencing locations, names, deployment times. Every piece she uncovered built a clearer image of her mother, not just as a hero, but as a woman walking into danger alone. Dana had volunteered for Cold Horizon. She had been stationed offshore, decoding foreign transmissions that were later flagged for national-level attention. In one report, Lila found a note in Dana's handwriting. "Intercept confirms internal breach. Recommend redirect or scrub." The file ended there. No indication of whether her mother's warning had been heard or ignored. That night, Lila sat on the floor of her apartment with printouts spread across the carpet. Sophie lay asleep in the next room, her soft breathing steady, the hum of the oxygen machine a familiar background rhythm. Lila circled lines, highlighted words, marked anything that looked like a clue. A timeline was forming, and in it, Dana Porter wasn't just collateral, she may have been silenced. Meanwhile, across town, Evelyn Clark met with the Marlowe Hotel's senior management in a private office overlooking the city skyline. The fallout from the gala was already spreading. Whispers of Admiral Hayes' public rebuke, concerned inquiries from gala sponsors, and now a complaint from the hospitality union after a staff member came forward about Evelyn's behavior. She smiled tightly, denying everything, spinning her version of events with practiced charm. She was unprofessional, she insisted. And the Admiral overstepped. But privately, Evelyn knew something had shifted. Lila had been quiet before. Easy to dismiss. Not anymore. And if Admiral Hayes was involved now, she needed to cover her tracks. She began deleting emails from her hotel account, records of her correspondence with the events planning firm, remarks about staff performance, even a petty memo about Lila's attitude. What Evelyn didn't realize was that Hayes had already spoken with the hotel's owner, who was a longtime military supporter and friend. There were limits to how far Evelyn's charm could take her. And those limits were closing in. Back in the archive room, Lila pulled one final file from the restricted batch, labeled only D. Porter, Preliminary Debrief. The document was heavily censored, but one sentence escaped the black ink. Subject considered possible defector after failing extraction window. Final status, presumed abandoned in the field. Lila's breath caught. Defector? Abandoned? The word pulsed on the page like a wound. She sat still for a long moment, the buzzing of the overhead lights pressing in like static. It didn't make sense. Dana Porter had been loyal. She had sacrificed everything. But this file painted her as a traitor, or worse, as someone the system had chosen to forget. Lila took a shaky breath, folded the file into her folder, and stood. She didn't know exactly what this meant yet. But one thing was clear, the truth about her mother was buried beneath lies, and someone had left her behind. The envelope was smaller than Lila expected, yellowed at the edges, corners bent, and sealed with a strip of tape that had dulled with time. It had no stamp, no return address, only her mother's name written in crisp, looping script across the front. Lieutenant Graves handed it to her in silence, his usual wry demeanor softened by something closer to reverence. She wrote this a few days before she disappeared, he said quietly. Said if anything happened, someone would find a way to get it to the right hands. Lila sat on a worn bench outside the archive building, her fingers hovering over the seal. Admiral Hayes stood beside her, silent, hands behind his back in a posture that looked almost like prayer. He hadn't asked to read it, hadn't demanded to see what was inside, but when Lila looked up at him, she saw the same questions she'd carried her whole life mirrored in his eyes. She broke the seal slowly. The sound seemed louder than it should have. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded twice, the ink faded but still legible. Lila unfolded it with trembling hands, her breath catching as the first words hit her like a stone. My sweet Lila and Sophie, if you're reading this, it means I didn't make it home. Her throat closed, the words swimming before her eyes. She blinked quickly, forcing herself to keep reading, her fingers gripping the paper like it might fly away. There are things I've seen, things I've heard, that I can't put into detail here. Just know this, if I'm gone, it's not because I left you. It's because someone made sure I couldn't come back. Hayes stepped closer, but still didn't interrupt. Lila's voice was barely above a whisper as she read aloud. I volunteered for Cold Horizon because I believed in the mission. But something shifted. Intercepts pointed to an internal leak. I sent warnings. No one listened. Her fingers clenched the page tighter. The next lines made her heart drop. If they tell you I defected, they're lying. I would never abandon you. I would never betray what I swore to protect. But I fear someone powerful wants this story buried. And if they succeed, my name will vanish or, worse, be rewritten. Lila couldn't breathe for a moment. The paper felt hot in her hands, like it had waited years just to burn now. She looked up at Hayes, who had lowered himself onto the bench beside her, his face pale and unreadable. She knew, Lila said. She saw it coming. Hayes closed his eyes for a moment, pain cracking the edges of his composure. She tried to warn us, he murmured, more to himself than to her. And we didn't listen. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring out across the concrete lot as if trying to find something beyond the horizon. I had a chance to pull her from the roster. I'd heard whispers about the mission, but I trusted the chain of command. His jaw tightened. I thought I was doing my duty. Now I know I failed her. Lila folded the letter again, more gently this time. She didn't blame you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Not by name. But the guilt radiating from Hayes was too deep to ignore, the kind that didn't need names to leave scars. You were part of the system that let her disappear, she added, her tone not cruel, but honest. Even if you didn't pull the trigger, you helped load the chamber. Hayes nodded slowly. I know, there was no defense, no excuse, only truth. And I won't let it happen again. Not to you. Not to Sophie. They sat in silence for a long moment, broken only by the distant rumble of traffic and the rustle of wind across the parking lot. Lila looked down at the letter again, at her mother's handwriting, the loops and slants that had once dotted grocery lists and lunchbox notes. Dana had written it not just as a goodbye, but as a warning, a map, a legacy. And now it was hers to carry. That evening, back at the apartment, Lila carefully slipped the letter into a sleeve and tucked it into her drawer, beneath Bill's and Sophie's school flyers. She didn't have the luxury of falling apart, not yet. She moved into the small kitchen and began prepping Sophie's favorite, boxed mac and cheese with cut-up hot dogs. A comfort dinner, the kind her mom used to make. But before the water could boil, she heard the cough. It came sharp, jagged, too sudden. Lila turned and saw Sophie at the hallway door, one hand on her chest, her face pale. The oxygen machine beside her was on, but the tube had slipped. Lila dropped the spoon and rushed over. Sophie's breaths were shallow now, her eyes wide with fear. "I can't," she tried to say. Lila scooped her up, heart pounding, grabbing the spare inhaler and already dialing the emergency line on her phone. "Hold on, baby. Just hold on," she whispered, her own panic buried beneath practiced calm. As the paramedics arrived, everything Lila had uncovered about her mother, the betrayal, the truth, the cover-up, faded behind the immediate terror of losing her sister. Because for all the answers she sought, for all the justice she craved, nothing mattered more than the life in her arms. This was her present, her future, her reason. And for the first time, she understood what Dana had meant about never choosing to leave. The auditorium was quiet except for the rustle of programs and the occasional murmur as guests found their seats. The Veterans Honor Forum was an annual tradition, a place for decorated officers, families, and military historians to gather and reflect. But this year, something unlisted had been added to the program. Admiral Robert Hayes stepped up to the podium, his full-dress uniform pressed to perfection, ribbons shining beneath the overhead lights. The room silenced as he took a long breath and began. "Before we proceed with today's schedule," he said, voice steady but heavy, "I need to speak a name that has not been spoken on a stage like this, but should have been, long ago." He glanced toward the third row, where Lila sat beside Sophie, both dressed modestly but neat, the weight of this moment not lost on them. Lieutenant Dana Porter was one of the finest cryptographers in naval intelligence. She served with honor, reported corruption, and disappeared under circumstances that were never fully explained. He paused. "That ends today." Gasps moved through the room like wind through wheat. The screens flanking the stage flickered to life, displaying a photo, Dana Porter in uniform, her smile bright but modest, her pendant barely visible above her collar. Her name was quietly removed from citations, her file sealed, her record treated as incomplete, Hayes continued. But it wasn't incomplete. It was silenced. Lieutenant Porter did not fail her country. Her country failed her. Applause began, slow at first, then rising like a wave. Hayes stepped back, allowing the image of Dana to speak louder than any words. Lila reached for Sophie's hand, her chest tight with emotion. For so long, her mother's name had been a ghost, something spoken only in private, remembered in whispers. Now it echoed off marble and microphone. The next day, news of Hayes' speech flooded military channels and spilled into the press. Headlines read, "Admiral breaks silence on cold horizon, buried hero finally recognized," and the redemption of Dana Porter. Investigative journalists began requesting interviews. Naval administration declined to comment. But people were talking, and this time, they weren't forgetting. Meanwhile, Evelyn Clark stood before the Marlowe Hotel's board, her hands clasped tight in front of her, her voice rehearsed but shaking. "It was a misunderstanding," she insisted. "The Admiral's involvement complicated protocol. I didn't know who the girl was, but it was no use." Her dismissal was unanimous. The hotel quietly released a statement acknowledging inappropriate conduct during a high-profile military event. Internal reviews confirmed multiple staff complaints had been ignored. Evelyn's contract was terminated without severance. And for the first time in years, she left a boardroom with nothing but silence behind her. The same silence she had imposed on others. At the apartment, Hayes arrived with documents and a plan. The Navy has discretionary humanitarian funds for families of veterans lost in active intelligence operations, he explained. We're filing you under that clause. I'll make sure it goes through. Lila blinked, unsure what to say. The folder contained approvals for new housing, healthcare coverage for Sophie, and a scholarship program in Lila's name. She looked at him across the table, her voice barely above a whisper. Why are you doing all this? Hayes didn't hesitate. Because I should have done it 15 years ago. He leaned back slightly. And because Dana would haunt me if I didn't. The new apartment was smaller than the one they had, but it was clean, quiet, and safe. Sophie had her own room, with curtains that fluttered in the afternoon light and enough space for her books and drawings. Lila stood by the window their first night there, watching traffic drift by in the distance. She didn't feel settled yet, but she didn't feel scared. And that, for now, was enough. Still, the letter from Dana wouldn't let her sleep. It sat in her nightstand like a compass, always reminding her where she came from and where she could go next. One afternoon, Lila visited a nearby recruitment center. She didn't walk in as a waitress looking for a second chance. She walked in as a daughter seeking justice. I want to train, she told the officer. Military intelligence. The same path my mother walked. Her scores from the aptitude test stunned the staff. She showed strong pattern recognition, language recall, and strategic problem-solving. Hayes received the call a week later. She's in, the voice on the other end said. And if she keeps this pace, she'll be the top of her class. That evening, he invited Lila to a quiet dinner at a naval mess hall near base. It was nothing fancy, just soup, warm bread, and a booth tucked away from the crowd. When they sat down, Hayes slid a small box across the table. This was Dana's, he said. Inside was a worn insignia pin, once removed from her dress uniform, now polished and preserved. I kept it. Couldn't bring myself to let it go. Lila lifted it gently from the box, cradling it in her palm. Thank you, she whispered. He nodded once, then said quietly, You have more of her in you than you realize. The words settled over them like a vow. And for the first time in a very long time, Lila Porter didn't feel like she was chasing her mother's shadow. She felt like she was stepping into the light her mother had once carried. If someone tried to erase your loved one's name from history, how far would you go to set the record right? Comment below. Have you ever stood up to protect someone's legacy? And if you believe names matter, especially the ones they tried to bury, subscribe now. Because next, Lila steps into the uniform no one thought she'd wear. The cemetery sat quiet beneath a soft spring sky, the kind of silence that wasn't empty but full. Wind moved gently through the trees, scattering petals across rows of white headstones, names etched in even rows, most known, some forgotten. Lila stood between two of them now, in front of a small bronze plaque nestled beneath an oak tree, no inscription, no rank, no title. Just space where a name should have been. She glanced sideways at Sophie, who held Hayes's hand tightly, her other hand gripping a bouquet of fresh wildflowers. This is her, Hayes said quietly, pointing to the unmarked plaque. The records wouldn't allow an official inscription, but she's here. Lila knelt and placed her hand flat on the metal, her touch tender, like she was introducing herself for the first time. Hi, Mom, she whispered. I'm sorry it took me this long to find you. They stood in silence for several minutes, the only sounds the wind and the occasional birdsong from the trees above. Sophie stepped forward and laid the flowers down with a gentleness that made Lila's throat tighten. She was still so young, but in this moment, she carried something ancient, reverence, grief, and understanding far beyond her years. Do you think she'd be proud of you? Sophie asked softly. Lila smiled through the ache in her chest. I think she'd be proud of us. Hayes stepped beside them and placed something small on the ground next to the plaque, Dana's insignia pin. It gleamed faintly in the sun, resting just above the flowers. She deserved a full ceremony, he said. Not a silence carved in government concrete. Lila nodded. But this is a start. Later that evening, the Navy Women's Tribute Gala took place in a high-ceilinged hall filled with uniforms, medals, and polished silver. But this year, something was different. Woven between the ceremonial ribbons and official citations was a moment that hadn't appeared in any program. Admiral Hayes stood at the podium, introducing someone few had heard of until now. Tonight, he began. We honor not just the women who served in plain sight, but also those whose stories were buried and those still brave enough to uncover them. He stepped aside and gestured toward Lila, now dressed in a navy blue blouse, hair swept neatly back, her mother's pendant resting visible and steady at her collar. She walked to the podium with poise she didn't know she had until recently, not stage confidence, but something deeper. A quiet sense of rightness. She adjusted the microphone with steady fingers and began to speak. "My name is Lila Porter," she said. "My mother was Lieutenant Dana Porter. For years, I was told she disappeared. But now I know she was silenced." The room listened, rapt. She was a mother. A protector. A soldier. She warned her superiors of a breach and was never heard from again. But her story didn't end in a file room or a grave. Her story continued in me. In my sister. In every woman whose service was erased because it was inconvenient or complicated. Hayes watched from the side, pride plain on his face, eyes misted but composed. Sophie sat near the front, legs swinging slightly under her chair, beaming up at her sister. Lila continued, her voice stronger now. "I'm training for military intelligence, like my mother once did. I don't want revenge. I want legacy. And I stand here not just because of her sacrifice, but because someone refused to let her be forgotten." The crowd rose to their feet before she even stepped away from the podium. It wasn't thunderous, it was reverent. A slow, standing ovation. One that said, "We hear you. We see her now." Backstage, after the applause died down and the photos were taken, Lila sat on a quiet bench just off the side hall, the noise of the gala muffled by heavy doors. Sophie crawled into the seat beside her, resting her head against Lila's shoulder. "You were amazing," she murmured. "So was Mom," Lila said softly. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the pendant, letting it dangle in the soft light. The chain was slightly frayed, the metal dulled with time, but it still carried weight, still carried story. She turned to Sophie and held it out. "Someday," she said gently, "this will be yours. Not because you need to carry our past, but because you'll know where you came from." Sophie took it in her small palm, eyes wide. "Does that mean I have to give a speech one day too?" Lila chuckled. "Only if you want to." They sat together in silence again, the pendant shining faintly between them. And for the first time, Lila didn't feel like she was standing in her mother's shadow. She felt like she was walking in her mother's light. The mornings came softer now. The air didn't carry the same weight it used to, no lingering fear of eviction notices, no quiet panic behind every breath. Lila stood beneath a blooming dogwood tree just outside the Naval History Memorial Park, clipboard in hand, radio clipped at her waist. Her ID badge read Liaison Officer, Civilian Military Outreach, but what it didn't say was how far she'd come to earn that title. What it didn't say was who she carried in her work and who had made it possible. Behind her, children laughed in the courtyard, darting between benches and flower beds under the watchful eyes of volunteers and parents. Among them, Sophie ran freely, her hair in a messy braid, her shoes untied but her steps joyful. She didn't cough anymore, not like before. Her lungs were strong, her face bright. The shadow of illness had lifted, and with it, the tightrope Lila had walked for years. Hayes arrived every Thursday just before noon, always with a newspaper tucked under his arm and a tin of lemon drops in his pocket. He didn't wear the uniform anymore, but the dignity never left him. He waved at Lila from across the lawn, pausing to chat with the groundskeepers like old friends. When he reached her, he tipped his head towards Sophie. "She's growing fast," he said. "Almost taller than you." Lila smiled, shaking her head. "She's already faster." They stood side by side, watching the courtyard unfold, a scene that, not long ago, would have felt like a dream. "You could have disappeared after the gala," she said. "Most men would have." Hayes just chuckled, low and quiet. "I owed you more than a speech." They often spoke without needing to fill the air, an understanding built over months, over truth, over forgiveness not asked for but given anyway. Hayes wasn't just a mentor anymore. He came to birthday dinners, helped Sophie with her school history projects, brought soup when Lila worked too late. He fit into their lives not like an addition, but like a piece that had always been missing. Sometimes, family isn't about blood, it's about who chooses to stay. That afternoon, Lila had been scheduled to lead a walking tour of the Memorial Gardens for a group of visiting high schoolers. She adjusted her lanyard, nodded to Hayes, and stepped toward the main plaza. Bronze plaques lined the walkway, each bearing the name of a woman who had served and sacrificed, including a new one installed just weeks ago. Lieutenant Lila Porter. It gleamed beneath the sun, a name no longer hidden, a legacy no longer denied. As the students lingered around the dedication wall, a young woman in a navy windbreaker paused beside Lila. She had sharp eyes and quiet curiosity, the kind that asked permission before asking questions. "Excuse me," she said, nodding toward Lila's chest. "That necklace, it's beautiful. What does it mean?" Lila touched the pendant gently, the old anchor and ribbon now polished but unchanged, resting against her blouse like a silent compass. "It belonged to my mother," she said, her voice soft but steady. "She gave everything for the truth. And it saved me when I didn't know I needed saving." The girl smiled, sensing the weight of the answer without needing the whole story. "That's really powerful," she said. Lila nodded, her fingers brushing the pendant once more. "It was her voice," she added, even after they tried to erase it. The young woman walked on, but Lila stood still for a moment, letting the silence settle like a benediction. Hayes rejoined her a few minutes later, carrying 2 bottled teas and a familiar grin. "You get asked about that pendant a lot now, don't you?" he said. Lila shrugged. "I don't mind," she replied. "It speaks louder than I ever could." He smiled, tapping a hand gently over his chest. "Sometimes, the things we carry say more than the words we've got left." They sat on a nearby bench while Sophie played hopscotch with 2 other kids, her laughter bright against the calm of the afternoon. Lila leaned back, the pendant warm from the sun. Everything had changed, but not all at once. It had been slow, steady earned. Not through vengeance. Not through rage. But through memory. Through legacy. And as the sun dipped lower and the shadows stretched long across the grass, she thought of her mother, of codebooks and lullabies, of unfinished goodbyes and unspoken promises. She thought of the letter, now framed in her room, and the life she had rebuilt around it. Hayes watched her in silence, his thoughts likely in the same place, stitched into the past, but grounded in the present. Lila looked toward the memorial once more and whispered to herself, as if Dana could hear it, "We made it." Sometimes, the people who save you don't wear capes, just medals, guilt, and the memory of a promise they never got to keep. Thank you for listening to this story until the very end. There's another interesting one on your left screen that I think you'll really enjoy.